Superman is famously opposed to tyranny and authoritarianism, which is kind of ironic considering he embodies everything authoritarian leaders claim to idolize: strength, power, and purity of purpose. But where fascists demand obedience, Superman offers compassion. Where tyrants enforce their will, Superman chooses restraint. A recurring theme in Superman stories has been what would happen if he ever changed his mind and decided that he knew what was best for everyone. You can see it in the old Silver Age comic books, stories about King Superman, and more recently in the Injustice video games. The DC animated universe even had a few stabs at it with episodes like Superman the Animated Series' Brave New Metropolis and its authoritarian Superman, as well as Justice League's A Better World with the Justice Lords. Similarly, they tackled the issue by bringing in two Kryptonian insurrectionists, straight from the Phantom Zone, an extra-dimensional prison for Krypton's worst criminals: Jax-Ur and Mala. Before talking about the way the show used these characters, it's important to look at the comic book source material to see how different they were. First things first, let's talk about Jax-Ur. His comic book counterpart is unrecognisable from the version seen in STAS. Originally, he was a Kryptonian scientist that dabbled in forbidden rocket-based experiments and accidentally destroyed an inhabited moon, killing thousands of people. He's another in a long line of bold Superman villains alongside figures like Lex Luthor, Brainiac the Parasite, and the Ultra-Humanite. Seriously, what did they have against follically challenged people? His unrepentant heresy and the deaths of so many people made him Krypton's worst criminal. Jax-Ur was a recurring figure in the Silver Age Superman comics. After a Phantom Zone communicator was invented, Jax-Ur and the rest of the criminals were a resource that Superman and Supergirl could turn to, although they weren't exactly trustworthy. In Jax-Ur's first appearance, Adventure Comics number 289, a freak astral incident allowed him to escape from the Phantom Zone. The first thing he did was head to Smallville to impersonate Superboy's adoptive father, Jonathan Kent. He pretended to have developed superpowers of his own and told his son that he had to stay home and do his chores instead of being a superhero. In reality, Jax-Ur was using Superboy's robots to round up all of the kryptonite on Earth to ensure that he could kill Superboy and then take over the planet. However, he accidentally gave himself away when he signed a purchase order with his real name rather than Jonathan Kent, while distracted. Superboy cast him back into the Phantom Zone where he remained. In later years, when a plague ravaged Atlantis, Superman turned to Jax-Ur to help develop a cure. The pair travelled back in time to Krypton to gather some necessary samples, but Jax-Ur also sought something more malevolent: crystal kryptonite. While the new variety of kryptonite didn't really have any malicious effects, Jax-Ur tricked Superman into believing that it made anything combustible explode in his presence, making him a danger to the world. In reality, Jax-Ur's powers had been enhanced by the crystal kryptonite, allowing him to destroy things in the real world from the Phantom Zone. Superman saw through the deception when he realised that only certain objects, like sea mines, blew up, and deduced that Jax-Ur was to blame. With Jax-Ur's deception uncovered, his upcoming parole was denied. While in the Phantom Zone, Jax-Ur worked with another rogue Kryptonian, General Zod, who had unsuccessfully attempted a coup back on Krypton. Whenever Zod was able to facilitate an escape from their spectral prison, Jax-Ur could usually be found backing him up. Following Crisis on Infinite Earths, when DC rebooted their continuity, DC became very strict about an edict that Superman was the only Kryptonian in the universe. That's why they spent so long holding off on reintroducing Supergirl. And when they pulled the trigger, she wasn't even a Kryptonian anymore. She was a shape-shifting, gloopy, protoplasmic person, but that's an entirely separate matter. So Jax-Ur and Zod faded into the background. When the time came for Superman the Animated Series to enter into development, the team initially planned on using General Zod and Ursa, with designs that were fairly faithful to the 1970s movie versions of the characters. But these plans were dropped. No one has provided a clear answer why. Some have suggested rights issues, others that the producers changed their mind about the direction of the show after their initial pitch for a more Fleischer Brothers look was scrapped. But ultimately, we sort of did get Zod in the form of Jax-Ur. They stripped away his accidental villainy and replaced it with something far more deliberate, dangerous, and, sadly, relevant. They made him a symbol of Krypton's militaristic past, a would-be dictator, a charismatic fascist cloaked in the rhetoric of restoration of former glory. Jax-Ur's longing to restore Krypton to its former greatness is no accident. It's a critique of nationalist nostalgia, the kind that fuels authoritarian movements across the globe. When he speaks, you can almost hear echoes of real-world demagogues who promise glory but deliver oppression. His second-in-command, Mala, an original creation for STAS but very similar to Ursula from the Superman movies, shows what happens when ideology becomes identity. She doesn't question Jax-Ur, she practically worships him, fighting for him, and nearly conquers the world on his behalf. Jax-Ur and his forces came incredibly close to overthrowing the Council of Krypton, but were thwarted by Jor-El, who deployed sonic weaponry to incapacitate them. The Council sentenced the insurrectionists to the Phantom Zone, but Mala was given a reduced sentence as they deemed that she had only been following orders. Jax-Ur, meanwhile, had the book thrown at him. In the two-part story Blasts from the Past, Superman comes across Mala while working with Professor Hamilton to study the Kryptonian technology that brought him to Earth. In a hitherto hidden compartment, Professor Hamilton found a Phantom Zone projector. Remember that Jor-El's original plan was to send as many Kryptonians to the Phantom Zone as possible to escape Krypton's destruction and then release them on a habitable world. Mala pleads with Superman to be released, stating that she has served her sentence and demands to speak to Jor-El and the Council of Krypton. After some debate and consulting the historical logs of Krypton, Superman determines that it is only fair that he releases Mala and brings her under his wing. It doesn't take long for Mala to get to grips with her new powers, but she puts her foot in her mouth by telling Lois Lane that she is there to support Superman with his mission of conquest. She made the assumption that they would take over Earth and build a new Krypton, which is kind of what Jor-El had in mind, if somewhat through a more fascist lens. Mala sees humanity not as people, but as a means to an end. Where Superman sees potential, Mala sees weakness. Her contempt for the powerless mirrors the core belief of every authoritarian regime, that strength is the only virtue, and mercy is for fools. Similarly, Mala assumed that she and Superman would mate to continue the Kryptonian species, but Superman is not down with that, and he contemplates returning her to the Phantom Zone after a series of violent outbursts. As the saying goes, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and so Mala releases Jax-Ur, reaffirming her loyalty to him and his cause. Once Jax-Ur is released, he doesn't actually do all that much. Mala is the one that does most of the heavy lifting, while he stands by and cheers her on. His passivity is the perfect condemnation of fascist leadership. He talks of honour and strength, but lets Mala do the dirty work. Like so many tyrants before him, he hides behind ideology while others bleed for his cause. Sure, Jax-Ur's powers take a little while to develop, but even when he's at full strength, he's no match for Superman. That doesn't mean he's incompetent. He steals the Phantom Zone projector and banishes Superman, which allows him, should I say Mala, to bully the United Nations into surrendering. However, Professor Hamilton creates a Phantom Zone projector of his own to release Superman, and the pair are swiftly reincarcerated. For as strong as they were no match for Superman, who has had decades of experience with his powers by this point. If you count the tie-in comics as canon, then Superman Adventures 7 and 8 contain the next story featuring the pair. Superman is uncomfortable with sentencing them to the Phantom Zone after he experienced the anguish of being imprisoned there, so he brings them back to Earth and shrinks them and keeps them in a small prison away from sunlight. Of course, the two escape and cause chaos, including Jax-Ur using Starlab's tech to turn himself into a massive titan. Superman defeats the pair, returns them to their normal size and shackles them in a room with a red sun lamp. This story adds some Silver Age silliness, the era to which Jax-Ur belongs, but it feels a little out of place, so I can understand why you might disregard it. When it comes to the tie-in comics, I tend to take the view that if members of the show's creative team ever worked on the comic, then it counts. Unless they say or do something that contradicts the events of the show. In that case, that specific story doesn't fully count. Given that Paul Dini wrote the first issue of Superman Adventures and Bruce Timm provided the cover, I view that as an endorsement. Jax-Ur and Mala returned in the series' 21st issue, which focused on Supergirl. This giant-sized issue was written by STAS writers Evan Dorkin and Sarah Dyer. This issue also introduces General Zod as an Argonian warlord that had attempted to invade Krypton but was imprisoned in the Phantom Zone. Zod gets released by Granny Goodness and Kanto, and then teams up with Jax-Ur and Mala to conquer Earth. There are a few things in this issue that make its canonicity a bit shaky. They state that Argonians are immune to kryptonite when that isn't the case in the show. Don't forget that Supergirl was an Argonian, not Superman's biological cousin. There's that pesky last Kryptonian edict from DC Comics again. And that she was taken out by a kryptonite missile in the two-parter Legacy. Likewise, there's little to distinguish Zod from Jax-Ur, which kind of makes Zod feel redundant. Regardless of your stance on the comics, Jax-Ur and Mala's final appearance came in the episode Absolute Power. A cosmic event causes a breach in the Phantom Zone, freeing the pair. However, they find themselves in outer space at the edge of a black hole. Fortunately for them, a group of researchers spot them and rush to their rescue. And how do they repay their act of kindness? By conquering their planet. I think that's a fundamental aspect of Jax-Ur's character. He completely downplays his own weakness and failings. He has no appreciation for others. He simply believes that he should rule. Mala is the muscle. She does most of the hard work. But she is completely dedicated to Jax-Ur's cause. She believes that they are the rightful rulers of basically whatever they want. Jax-Ur has a rock-solid ego and papier-mâché courage. He uses his position of comparative power to dominate those people and their own homeworld, forcing them to build a society that, on the surface, looks pleasant and civilized, but it doesn't stand up to any scrutiny. A cursory glance beneath the surface tells us that the people are brutalized, forced to build weaponry which will be pointed at Earth, all to soothe Jax-Ur's bruised ego. When Superman comes across a ship being sucked into the same black hole, he rescues them and takes them back to their nearby homeworld, where he is attacked. It turns out the ship was an executioner's vessel, and the passengers had been sentenced to death for resisting Jax-Ur's rule. While Jax-Ur acts cordially towards Superman, he tells him to leave the planet and stay out of his business. And Superman is reluctant to intervene. He argues that a battle between the three of them would lead to calamitous destruction, but at the same time I suspect he just didn't want the hassle of dealing with them. However, when Superman is shown the weapons of war the people are being forced to build, and that their intended target is Earth, he joins the fight for freedom. This episode is a damning indictment of colonialism, imperialism, fascism, call it whatever you want. At the end of the day, it's immoral because, at its core, it's the act of stealing. They steal land, lives, labour, culture, and autonomy, all under the guise of civilization and progress. Those that resist are turned into pariahs, criminalized, incarcerated, and executed. At the same time, it takes a strong stance against those that stand by and idly watch others' rights be ripped away from them. By the episode's end, Superman acknowledges his earlier error and vows never to stand on the sidelines again. We also see that those that cooperate with the Kryptonians aren't free from their ire either. When a servant spills a drink, Jax-Ur massively overreacts, and Mala uses one of their guards, Alteris, as an object to pleasure herself. You can clearly see that it disgusts him, and I think that's part of why she does it. The majority of the population resents them for taking their freedom under the guise of enlightening them, and when the time comes, none of them help Jax-Ur and Mala. When they try to execute Superman, Alteris rebels, sending the pair into the black hole. Jax-Ur and Mala are in a small group of Superman villains that were killed off in Superman the Animated Series, and honestly, I really wish we lived in a world where their toxic ideology was also consigned to the history books. Jax-Ur and Mala are more than just Phantom Zone criminals. They're warnings of what happens when strength is worshipped without compassion, and when power is treated as a birthright instead of a responsibility. They remind us that tyranny often arrives in the guise of salvation, dressed in the old colours of patriotism and glory. But Superman refuses to rule. He refuses to conquer. And that is what makes him a hero. He doesn't stand for one nation or one people. He stands for everyone. He's not a god above us. He's a man among us. And when authoritarians rise and when dim-witted fascists dream of new empires, Superman is the one who reminds them that no matter how powerful you are, you do not get to decide the fate of others. Because control is not order, dictatorship is not peace, and obedience born of fear is the prelude to ruin. Superman shows us that the minute we stop resisting tyranny, even in its most polished form, we become the architects of our own shackles. Because one way or another, unchecked power does not lead to peace or prosperity. It leads to ruin. Okay, that's it for this week's essay. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, tell all your friends about me. You know how YouTube works. If you really enjoyed the video and have the means, please consider making use of the thanks button to send a buck or two my way, because every little helps. I offer channel memberships for $1.99 a month. This will get you early access to my weekly video essay, priority responses to your comments, members-only videos, custom emojis, and an icon on your profile indicating that you're one of my people. And special thanks to my channel members. Everyone who was a member at the time of this video's creation is listed on the screen right now. If you want to see your name amongst all these wonderful people, join the channel now. Next time, I'll be back on Monday with a video that many of you have asked for. Yes, I'll be talking about Batman's supervillain counterpart from another universe, Owlman, as seen in Justice League Crisis on Two Earths. And then next Friday, it's another popular request from the futuristic streets of Neo Gotham. It's time to talk about the ghost of adolescence gone wrong, Batman Beyond's Willie Watt. Hope to see you then.